right. Hey, everybody. Welcome to GRC201. My name is Jessie Skibby, and I'm the head of AWS Security Assurance Services, LLC. I'll explain a little bit more about that in a bit. But I also wanted to introduce, I have Chad, who is a security practice manager with Amazon Web Services, and Navas, who is the cloud governance specialist for AWS. We're going to hear a little bit more from both of them as we go. But let me go ahead and get into the agenda for today. So what are we going to cover? We're going to cover, first of all, we're going to start with cloud security governance. And the reason why we have compliance is to measure how well we're doing with our cloud security governance strategy. So we're going to start there, kind of underlying the why compliance is important to have in place. And then we're going to talk a little bit about what is going on today and why compliance needs to be modernized. Like as we move to the cloud, as we're developing maturity in our compliance system, we need to think about ways that can improve. And then we'll start talking about how you can implement control automation in your environment, taking a look at your existing controls and finding out what you can automate using AWS services. So we're going to dive super deep into the technical components of those services. And then we're going to talk more broadly about continuous compliance and how you have visibility over that compliance in the system. And then I'm going to come back on stage after Navas and Chad have talked about those technical components and show you how we wrap all of that up into the final stage, which is audit. So we're going to start with the control environment, how you implement those controls, how you automate them and have visibility, and then ending with how do you do continuous audit in AWS. So I'm going to start again with an overview of why we're here. And this really is a journey. So what we're taking you through today is that journey, like I said, from understanding the why to the technical components and then how you can automate that. The cloud security governance in general, right, we want to think about this as a continuous cycle. And it all starts at the very top with what your risk is. And a lot of times when I talk to customers about this, we like to show kind of two bookends, right, when you're thinking about risk. Your threat modeling in the very beginning, and at the end, you're really talking about incident response, right? Because all of it in between is about good security. There's also components to consider in your risk, like all of the regulatory requirements that you are facing, regardless of where you are in the world. Regulated industries such as financial services and healthcare have an abundance of these regulations they're all trying to comply with. All of those go into the business risk of the organization. From there, we want to build a framework. And so a framework serves across your hybrid environment, your multi-cloud environment, your AWS environment, right? Those are those higher level control objectives that you're going to turn into technical controls as we move along. And then you're going to look for ways to automate this. And the reason why I've represented this in a cycle is because the cycle never ends. Because every time you look at a new application, you do a new threat model, you have new and impending regulation that's changing, you're always looking at ways of changing what's in that top level risk category. And so that changes the whole cycle continuously, right? This is a continuous improvement cycle, and compliance automation and control implementation is just one component of that. But overall, you're telling the story of how you're maintaining good security governance over your environment. So why do we want to do this in a cloud environment? Well, this slide represents, to me, the ideal state scenario, right? So in the cloud environment, all of your developers can move very, very fast. And so if I'm talking to primarily governance, risk, and compliance people in the audience, you know, like typically in most companies, there's a ratio of somewhere to maybe it's 50 to 1, maybe it's 100 to 1 ratio of development team members to security team members. And that is not a good way to be able to move fast and scale those applications in a fast way, right? So we need to modernize our compliance approach so we're moving farther left. And so what this slide represents is how the central security team operates between the developers on the left and how you actually get through the AppSec approval faster, right? So the way you do that faster and at cloud pace is through implementing those security controls. I like to say guardrails over gates, because what you want to do is create that control environment that's easy to adopt. Developers can have access to all the information they need to get through that final stage of AppSec faster. And if this slide looks familiar to you, this is very much similar to what we do at AWS. So the AWS way, we call it security guardians, and it's a way of embedding security into the development teams so that you have that internal champion in your development teams that understand those security expectations and can make sure they're built in prior to that application launch, right? So the application launch, the rocket ship, is how you move at cloud pace with security and compliance coming along with as part of your journey. So speaking of journey, I am going to hand it off to Chad, who's going to talk a little bit about why our traditional compliance needs to be modernized.
Good morning. Chad Lawrence. I'm with AWS Professional Services. I'm here to talk to you about compliance journey. Jesse did a great job of kind of setting up the why and the overall governance. But we want to take the next step and really start talking about how do you transform your compliance and audit programs to make sure that they are efficient and scalable using the cloud to scale. How do you use that to leverage compliance as a differentiator for your company? And how do you future-proof your compliance and audit programs so that you're ready for the coming changes and dynamics of compliance in today's world? So to do that journey, we kind of have to start with our status quo. Where are we today? 27% of failed controls are due to human error. 33% of control failures are due to lost knowledge. This is significant. This is the breakdown of our programs continues to happen as we are reliant on people and manual processes. We continually are introducing errors that hold us back and hold back both the efficiency and efficacy of our programs. On top of that, 40% of compliance cost is indirect. That means not in the compliance team, not accounted for. That's all that work we push out to subject matter experts in the business, taking them away from developing for the business and focusing on compliance. Those are also the same resources that leave the company and create errors because we lose that internal knowledge. Because so much of manual audit is dependent on the knowledge and skill set of the SME and how they interpret the controls that we've put in front of them. So what does this status quo look like? For most of us, it looks like a giant control spreadsheet, right? You've all seen the meme where this was the audit job I thought I took, this was the compliance officer job I thought I took. What it ended up being is Excel. Right? We find ourselves in this central control tracking spreadsheet for a lot of our work right now. On top of that, we tend to be reliant on point-in-time audits, right? And you guys all know what this looks like. You load it all up into your ticketing system and you fire it out and let the compliance quarter begin, where everybody's bogged down, chasing tickets and trying to fill out that. On top of that, those individuals that are doing that attestation are doing very manual processes. We're doing old-style screenshots. We're trying to gather lots of data. It's very heavy lift. And again, it's often up to the interpretation of that subject matter expert in the field who may or may not have the correct audit control that we're looking for interpretation. And there's a whole training process involved in that. So this is kind of our status quo today. And we're going to talk about where we want to go from here. But first, I want to dive a little bit into why you have to transform and why you have to transform now. Hopefully you're all familiar with the term data gravity. If you're not, it's time to be. AI, ML, Gen AI is here. It is pulling data at a rapid pace into your cloud environments that can handle that kind of compute power. As that data moves, your controls are going to have to move with it. And those controls are moving to the cloud. And so it is really important to understand 60% of all corporate data is now stored in the cloud. That is only going to continue to increase. So you have to figure out how to get your audit programs into the cloud and around this data. Furthermore, the emerging technologies are all in the cloud. I'm going to pick on data warehousing because it's a great example. 89% of companies surveyed said now or in the near future they're planning to build a data warehouse. So you're going to see 90% of companies data warehouse, and the most likely location of that data warehouse is going to be in the cloud. 55% are already there, 21% are already experimenting with it, and 13% plan to use. So most of you actually probably already have a data warehouse in the cloud, whether you're aware of it or not. So where does that leave us? Compliance is getting more complex. It's getting more dynamic. It's getting more distributed. It's getting more regulated. We all know that, right? We feel that. And it's getting more costly. So this cannot scale. And I love this quote. We have a legal regulatory framework built on the basis of mail, paper, and words, versus a new world order which is digital, continuous, 24/7, and built on bits and bytes. Somehow we need to square these two worlds. And that's what we're here to talk to you about today. That's the journey we hope to take you on. I'm going to back up one step now and talk about our first pain point. It's that spreadsheet. It's that control matrix that we all have where we map all our controls against each other. You guys have probably seen this before, but I want you to think of this as your first opportunity to innovate, right? You've got this giant spreadsheet. It lines out all your controls to what regulations, and you've got this control mapping, right? And this was kind of our first order of efficiency when we realized we didn't want to audit the same control over and over and over 100 times during the course of the year, right? So this is your first order of efficiency, but it is a setup to get you to your next stage, right? You no longer need to rely on a spreadsheet to manage all these standards. You no longer have to manage on a spreadsheet to try to direct your people in the field how to correctly audit or how to audit those controls. And you no longer have to allow their testing ability or the cost of the business to pay for it. And so with that, I'm going to hand off to Navas to talk to you about what that control automation looks like.
It's important to introduce some efficiency and improvements to how we approach this in the cloud. And this means through dashboards that provide you with your compliance data and the implementation of technical controls through automation. This reduces errors. It also lowers the staff requirements and increases the audit scope that you can do. And this is especially very important in the cloud as you use computing power on demand. It can scale up and down. And one of our key services that helps you do this is AWS Config. AWS Config, at its base definition, lets you assess, evaluate, and audit the configuration of resources as well as the resource changes. And what this means is that it will provide you with a configuration item anytime there's a change with a resource. And there's a number of use cases where config is used by our customers. The first one's obvious. It will identify misconfigurations with EC2 instances and other resources. So for example, if you're running a Kubernetes cluster, it can tell you what version the cluster is on, and then you can make the appropriate changes. The second is, and depending on what your organization is up to, you might be conducting mergers and acquisitions and even divestitures, which then means that you will need to understand what's taking place within the new environment before bringing it into your existing environment. And that's why it's important to have an inventory management analysis, which config can help you with. And we'll talk more about that. The third use case, and Chad touched upon it, was also about the cost efficiencies. As part of this opportunity to understand what resources are doing, we can often tell if a team is using an inappropriate EC2 type that's not part of your savings plans. And then with config, just moving a little deeper into it, it also offers auto remediation, and this is conducted through Systems Manager automation runbooks. It scales across multiple regions and multi-account, and you can also create custom config rules and policies. So diving a little deeper into AWS Config, you can enable rules through the console. You can also view the compliance state of resources from its dashboards, but it also offers APIs. And so that's a very powerful mechanism because you can integrate it into your workflow management systems. And then we have SNS and CloudWatch. With SNS, it gives you alerts and notifications that you can send to your teams if they're working on certain kinds of resources. CloudWatch, you have some CloudWatch integrated dashboards with config. And S3 and CloudTrail Lake are the targets for the config data. So there, when the configuration items are stored within S3 and CloudTrail Lake, you can run some further analysis, build out your custom dashboards, and maybe even query the data using Athena. Now, more on the config dashboard. You can use it to track your assets. It will also provide you a picture in time of the configuration changes across all of your resources. And it will tell you about conformance packs. And the conformance packs are groups of config rules that are distributed across your multi-account environment. It will list out the conformance packs and tell you what the non-compliant rules are within your environment. This config dashboard also gives you trends, information on what are the top 10 accounts that may have non-compliant resources or even the top 10 regions. And that's very useful information if you're running environments that have tens to hundreds of accounts. Config Advanced Query, also a very powerful feature. And this one is useful because when you have config enabled across your multi-account environment, you can run queries that tell you what is the number of EC2 instances that I have in a particular set of accounts, or the number of DynamoDB instances. This is all related to inventory management. It's all based on SQL queries, and under preview, config also supports natural language queries where you can simply write in simple English terms and it will translate it into a SQL query that you can immediately run. So a very valuable feature to understanding what resources you're running within your environment. Now, on manage rules with config, you might be wondering, okay, how do I set up config rules within our multi-account environment? We have config rules within Control Tower, Security Hub, that you can immediately get started with using. You can enable these rules through the console or through APIs. And with some of the rules, they also have positive and negative test cases. So as part of your compliance journey, you can actually audit the rules. The reason why we developed these managed rules is to help with your compliance process. Instead of spending months or weeks to develop a control, these controls give you a good starting point. You can actually view what's within the controls to help you develop your custom rules. They're easy to deploy, and you can expect AWS to continue to manage these rules. Now on conformance packs. Conformance packs are groups of config rules. They can be deployed across your multi-account organization, so AWS organizations, AWS Control Tower. We support a number of different security frameworks. That includes PCI, FedRAMP, SOC, HIPAA, and more. And oftentimes, you can use the conformance packs, again, as a starting point where you can add your custom rules and develop your own conformance packs. So some best practices on conformance packs. We spoke about the first one, but the second, it's also a very important one. You can have such a thing as too many rules, and if they're duplicates or unnecessary rules, it creates noise. And that's something that we'd all like to avoid because we want to focus on what's critical and important to the organization and then move forward. So avoiding duplicate and overlapping rules is going to be helpful. The second is use the organizational conformance packs and deploy them with either CloudFormation stack sets or Terraform. Basically, use infrastructure as code to deploy your conformance packs. Now, we spoke about config, what it is, how to deploy groups of config rules. The third part here is how do you create custom config rules? And this is where AWS CloudFormation Guard comes into play. It's our low-code, policy as code tool. And what you see here, and the reason why you can't see the text is because it's meant to be like that. It's our configuration item, shares a lot of information. But as compliance experts, we're really very interested in ensuring that EBS volumes are true, are encrypted as true, the state is available, the volume type is GP3. How do you do that? And to do that, you use CloudFormation Guard, write it as a policy, and it becomes a very simple task to do. Just a few lines of code, and you can ensure this across your multi-account environment. The nice thing here is that CloudFormation Guard is natively integrated with AWS config. It doesn't result in a Lambda function and rule. It just automatically deploys into your AWS environment. So here, that's an example of how it identified a compliant, non-compliant volume. Now, if you did want to develop something that's highly customized, we also have another option for you. You can use RDK, and there that will output the Lambda function as well as the rule. Very useful if you're developing custom configuration items from config. I don't expect many to use RDK, but if you do use it, you can also integrate it with Amazon Q Developer, which will accelerate this process with RDK. It's really helpful for the advanced development of custom config rules. The recommendation here is to use CloudFormation Guard and then top it off with RDK. Now on config aggregator, so going back to the multi-account environment, we have to store, you're receiving a lot of configuration items across your organization. Could be from multiple accounts, could be from your entire organization. Config aggregator summarizes all of the config data into a central location and provides you with a dashboard. There are two ways to run a config aggregator. You can execute it within one account and then run it across multiple regions, or you can run it across multiple accounts, multiple regions. You can definitely have multiple config aggregators within your multi-account environment depending on your use case. Control Tower sets up config aggregator in the security account. So here, config rules give you a number of different levers. And you can set up periodic, you can set up continuous recording, and you can also enable it, like manage versus custom rules. The point I'd like to make here is that it's a very key compliance service, and it's integrated with a number of different AWS services. This includes Trusted Advisor, Backup, Control Tower, Security Hub, and more. So just be aware, when you make property changes to config, it may have some downstream impact on some of the integrated services. And with that, Chad's going to come talk to us about Security Hub and Control Tower.
Thank you. So that's our first step on that compliance journey, understanding how you leverage AWS config to replace that spreadsheet, to automate those individual controls, and have a central dashboard instead of a spreadsheet tracking those automated controls. And that's our first piece of automation. So let's talk about the next place. Where we want to be is continuous compliance. And this isn't something that many of us think about when we think about on-premise, but this is really the power of the cloud. Once you've automated these controls, it allows you to shift to a component where you're no longer dependent on those people in the field. You're no longer pushing that attestation to the field. And it gives you a shift left kind of opportunity. If you can assess controls at any time at no cost because you've already built them and now it's just deploying or pushing a button to assess them, you can now shift left your compliance detections. Think about what that means. You could do instant audits. You could, if you're at GXP compliance, you could build it into your pipeline and say every version of my code is GXP compliant, and I can validate that before it ever even pushes to production. So no longer do I have to have a long test cycle where everything gets built, and then the auditors and compliance comes in, does the checks, finds all the things wrong. You go back to the process, and you do that, 2 or 3 washes before it finally comes out right? Here's an opportunity to push it into the process and say instantly, okay, those changes you just made, developer, just affected our outcome for compliance. And so you get that instantaneous feedback. You're literally training your people in the field on being compliance engineers, right? You want your DevOps guy to also be your compliance engineer. You want him to have that understanding of when I do this, it has this impact on my overall company audit compliance stance. Also gives you the opportunity to have near-time real deployment of new standards. So imagine you're in the boardroom or you're sitting down with your CIO and they say, oh my gosh, new standards in Europe, probably, of course, right? Coming down to us, how's that going to impact us? You say, oh, actually, I was able to quickly run an assessment against our cloud environment. 50% of our controls already apply. We have another 50% that we're going to have to build. I'm estimating that's going to cost us about $2 million up front to build and probably save us $6 million over the next 5 years. You have a lot better chance than coming next year and saying, oh my gosh, we don't know how to audit all this. We need help. We need money. Give us resources from the business, right? So it gives you an opportunity to be able to have that next level talk track with your executives. So I want to talk about some real results. I threw out some numbers there, and let me give you what that's based off of. There was a study done that said that 50% of our controls, if you have less than 50 controls and you automate 25% of them, you'll have a 52% cost reduction in your audit and compliance program. Now, a lot of you may have more than 50 controls. I know I did. If you have greater than 50% controls and 25% of them are automated, you'll have a 27% cost reduction in your audit and compliance programs. So you can do the math on your own programs to understand what the implication of that is, but it effectively breaks down to 1 to 2% cost savings per control you automate. Obviously, as a compliance person or an audit person, you're going to want to look at those controls that have the greatest manual cost and do those first. Or, as you saw with Navas's presentation, we have some managed rules, so take some quick wins where you can just instantly turn on some of those automations and immediately see that cost benefit. So what does that look like in the AWS world? One of the ways we get there is this central viewpoint, and this is how we get that data down to those developers to tell them, holy cow, that change you just made affected our compliance. We do that with a service called Security Hub. Security Hub is very powerful. It can feed all the way up to a central account that gives you visibility over your whole organization, but it also can push down to individual accounts. So that developer, when he makes that change in that account, he immediately gets Security Hub feedback that you just dropped this account out of compliance. What is the magic of some of that? We actually talked about one piece, which is config, but all of our security services have tie-ins into Security Hub. So you're getting broad visibility across your entire AWS organization. And this is really key because depending on what control you're assessing, it may be over in the IAM space or it may be over in your vulnerability management space, and you want to have visibility on all those pieces. So you can build config rules, but you can also suck in AWS services, feed that all into Security Hub, and get an output that tells you where you're at. So the unified integration and unified dashboard is one of the key pieces to getting to that continuous compliance. Again, we have built-in integrations with all our services, but this also includes third-party services. This isn't just AWS specific. Most of our partners will give you a conductor to connect to Security Hub and push data into, and actually a number of our partners recognize the value of Security Hub to the point they're actually putting connectors to pull data out of that into their sources. So this is really a key part of the ecosystem and understanding your audit and compliance. There's a lot of integrations that enable this, API, CLI, and it uses a common finding format that you can also look at, which allows you to build your custom tools, to connect your GRC. There are so many options on how to integrate this, so you can pull that back into your internal processes as well. So what does that kind of look like? You get this continuous monitoring dashboard. This is what boils up, but also pushes down to those individual accounts where they can immediately see, hey, not only did I introduce a risk, but I introduced it in this region on this particular resource. And oh gosh, it looks like I really screw up that resource a lot. I should probably figure out what I'm doing wrong with my buckets, go back to my infrastructure as code and make those adjustments. So now instead of you chasing someone down with a giant list and saying, got to fix all this, they're proactively saying, ooh, next version, let's go ahead and tweak that setting on all my buckets. And they just eliminated a huge amount of noise in your audit and compliance programs. So that continuous assessment is going to be key to having compliance, continuous compliance. It is also measured against baseline standards. You can either build your own or you can pull in industry standards. And there's also a very, very helpful standard that I really want to point out, which is the AWS Foundational Security Best Practices. This is the most dynamic, most updated standard. So this is us telling you AWS best practices, what we think they are, how we're measuring them. We've already enabled and built those config rules and all those things on the back end. You simply enable it here and it'll give you that instant feedback on best practices. So when I talk about future-proofing, when I talk about seeing into what you're going to be compliant to in the future, this is one of the key things. This is where AWS is telling you, hey, guess what? On Bedrock for your AI ML, this is where we think you should be putting in controls before those standards even hit market and get pushed out. So I already brought up AI ML, so let's go all in and talk about what else does this enable. Some of you are already being challenged to bring into your security, your compliance and audit programs by your executives. How do we do this better with AI ML? How do we use Gen AI here? I have an answer for you. We've got the link up there in the corner. But what we do is we dump all that data from Security Hub out into a security lake. In the security lake, that enables us the ability to query with Amazon Athena, which is the traditional way we've done it in the past. But you can also now bring that out to Amazon QuickSight, which is now Q-enabled. So now you can do real language queries. You don't have to figure out how to write your own SQL queries. You can do language queries in QuickSight back against that security lake. We can always build and have pre-built AI ML models with SageMaker that snap in on that. And then, of course, language models on Bedrock. So now you can bring in any of the popular language models out there, test it against your queries in your security lake. You can start asking compliance and audit questions to your Bedrock model and see what that immediate feedback is. So now we've lowered the threshold for what's hours and hours of drilling through spreadsheets, lining up columns, trying to pull in data. Now you can ask the model up front. So this is an amazing pattern. It's just going to continue to improve and grow. Again, Bedrock gives you access to all kinds of models, so you have a lot of experimentation. But if you're trying to show to your executives, hey, here's what we think the future looks like, here's where we're having wins, here's where we could use maybe a partner to come in or AWS to come in and help us, this is a great model to set up. Again, that code will take you right to it. So now that we've got that automation and we're doing continuous compliance, the next piece really comes in is, how could I get proactive and preventive, right? Now I just don't want to be gathering reports and hearing where I am at. How can I make sure we don't keep on doing the same stupid things over and over again, right? Because that hurts everybody. That hurts the business. That hurts your developers. No one wants to keep on getting the same feedback over and over. So we have two other controls. Our AWS config controls are really focused primarily around detective. But we have two other ways to go, which is our proactive and our preventive controls. And these this is where we start talking about differentiators, where your AWS environment, when code gets pushed up to it, says, sorry, I've got a proactive control there, or preventative control there, you can't deploy this to AWS. Or even better, thinking as a DevOps person, you're now going to build hooks into the pipelines that they push code out. And in the pipeline, you have a proactive control that says, wait, stop this in the pipeline, send it back to the developer, tell them to tweak this setting so that we'll be in compliance. And so this is where we want to get, is to that forward thinking. So not only are we telling them in the account you moved us out of compliance, we're telling them all the way back in the pipeline while they're still hands-on keyboard with their code saying, nope, stop, go back and do this. And you know what? Developers do not like to be blocked. They learn really fast when you block them in the pipeline, right? There's no chasing them down and saying, go get a budget and go figure this out. They're trying to meet deadlines. They're only going to get blocked once or twice before they figure that out. Now you've actually upskilled your own development team to be your compliance and audit champions and engineers. Working backwards from that, the output is now you have a business outcome from compliance and audit versus a cost driver. Now you can speed the market. You can say, hey, if you can help us fund this, we can get to market faster with our products and a higher level of confidence in our compliance and audit. So anybody who publishes code out to customers, this should be at the front of your initiatives. There's also a huge cost here that's harder to articulate, but we're all very aware of, right? And that's that rework. I've mentioned it a number of times, where you keep going back to the cycle and saying, no, I can't prove this, or you're under pressure and they say, oh, we're against the deadline. Can you push this out non-compliant, right? Nobody wants to have those conversations, right? And so this is the opportunity to get in front of that and avoid that cost. And so that's another hidden cost that you're eliminating through some of this automation. Just want to take a quick step back and look at what does this structure look like. So the key to enabling some of this automation, so we've built the controls, but how do we apply them to our whole environment? And that's kind of a concept that we call control tower or a landing zone. Control tower is our best practice landing zone. You don't have to use control tower. It makes life easier. It's a fast path. But if you have a landing zone, you can do multi-account management, federated identity management, centralized logging, cross-account audit, and end-user access provisioning. You have the core tools to enable that. And you can see there's a tie-in now between compliance and security here, right? Now we're talking about speed to being able to deploy those kind of sandbox environments and experimenting and growth, which is going to be really key when we start talking about AI, ML, and everybody wants to play with it, right? How do you deploy that quickly and securely in a way that you're confident you're not creating more compliance and audit? That's what this helps you do, is make sure that you're setting up those accounts correctly up front. And of course, then it gives you the centralized monitoring audit, so you're not running around asking, hey, where are the logs? How do I audit this? How do I look into it? It brings it all into a central audit account for you. So Control Tower itself has built-in 513 default controls. So you saw a view of it from Navas, where we're showing you could click these controls. There's 513 different controls that you can drill into there with 3 frameworks that are fully built out. So I want to talk a little bit about that. We hit the detective with a lot of the AWS config. We talked about preventative overlays on that control tower. It says nothing in this organization can do A, B, or C, right? And so it's kind of the hammer to make sure nothing bad happens. And then we have the proactive. That's where we're pushing it back into the pipelines and helping the developers. So I'm going to use the world's simplest example, and it admittedly doesn't completely apply because we've gone to default on some of these things, but I love the simplicity of this example, where you're told to encrypt data at rest, which everybody loves, really broad, undefined things like that. So we take that encrypt data at rest. What does that look like in your biggest data store, S3? You know, we know that we have multiple benchmarks that point to this, so we know this meets a number of control objectives. So we take that S3 bucket, and we say, okay, first of all, we want to detect if it's encrypted. So pretty simple. Tell me if it's bad so I can send it off to the right people, hold the right people accountable. But the next level is prevent. Now I'm going to go to that organizational level and say, thou shalt not create S3 buckets that don't encrypt. So now you've got another layer of control. You still have your detective because you want to know if someone figured a way around that. You want to have that visibility, but you also want to have the preventative. You cannot. And you cannot can be frustrating because now you're breaking code that's pushing out, right? So we want to get back to that proactive where you put a hook into the pipeline and you say, okay, this code can't be published until you put in this parameter that will encrypt your bucket. So now that developer has that instant feedback. And so that's the full model end-to-end that we're trying to get to. How that kind of looks, we have these pretty roll-ups into Control Tower and Security Hub where you can go, you get the dashboards, you get the metrics and scores that you can show your executives. And again, you can also show those developers in the field. So we've taken the first step. We've talked about automation. We've talked about the power of continuous compliance. Now we're going to talk about that final stage, about how do you collect evidence and attestation. And with that, I'm going to hand off to Jesse.
All right, I get to bring it home with audit. And so one thing I hope that everyone is getting from this presentation is really how, like, when we see this in true implementation, when we dive deep with customers, it's about the 3 lines of defense really coming together, right? The audit needs to understand first-line controls. Like, what are we building? How are we incorporating the right control development in our dev teams? And so some of the tooling that we've looked at today, such as the config dashboard, such as Security Hub, think about a future where that's actually being used within product teams, right? Because they're responsible for owning security and compliance of the application that they're building. So as you're thinking about your own internal maturity, if you're not doing that today, I want you to just think about that. Some of the tools and things that we've looked at can be used within different lines of defense as you're scaling and you're modernizing your compliance approach. And so what I'm going to wrap things up with is audit. And the one thing I failed to mention earlier is that I built an audit team for AWS 6 years ago. So what we do day in and day out is we help customers prepare for and pass audits. And so what we're going to talk about today are some of the key components of what you need to be able to collect the evidence, showing your auditor or regulator how you're leveraging the cloud to protect the cloud. And so we're going to start with compliance maturity, automation, attestation. Let me get these going on here. So what we want to do over time is show reduction of costs. I know Chad hit on several cost savings techniques, like 1% to 2% savings in cost. And think about the traditional methods of audit. I know when I joined AWS 6 years ago, one of my primary goals was I want to stop shoulder surfing, I want to stop Excel spreadsheets, and I want to stop screenshots. Because a screenshot is a point-in-time picture of something that you don't know is still compliant hours later, right? And so one of the things that you can really think differently about when you look at your cloud environment is that continuous compliance and continuous audit. Like, there's a whole new opportunity to do continuous audit and decreasing the time, right? Because you don't need a physical person taking a screenshot. You have this automated evidence gathering that's going on in the background. And you can make sure that that aligns to your risk profile. So I want to talk a little bit about Audit Manager. And one thing that I don't have a slide prepared for, because it was just released last week, was the Common Control Library. One of the things that I'm super excited about is the customers that we work with today, rarely is it just one compliance framework. Like, okay, this is a PCI DSS compliant application. PCI is the primary framework. That is rarely the case, and it's just one. Normally, it's I need to maintain compliance with FFIEC, SOC 2, ISO 27001, maybe even NIST 853. The list goes on and on, right? So the new Common Controls Library within Audit Manager that I personally am very excited about is the ability to assess once and apply that to many. And so when you're building your own custom framework within Audit Manager, you can select from a list of controls that will apply to many different frameworks. And so tying this all together with what Navas and Chad took us through, all of those custom config rules that you also built, in addition to managed rules that are available, are also pulled and can be pulled into Audit Manager for assessment. So you take the time on the front end, building those foundational controls, launching them through Control Tower with config, Security Hub checks. there are all kinds of technical evidence gathering that's all funneling into Audit Manager, including API calls. And so the most recent release of the Common Controls library also includes additional checks that if you are using Audit Manager today and ran attestations, you would want to look at new ways because there's more and more evidence being brought in. And so if you're not familiar with Audit Manager, this is a very basic view today of what it looks like when you go in and you can see which of your systems are in compliance and not in compliance. So it's a way for you to organize the report output, and also the evidence finder feature of Audit Manager is super helpful to drill right down into evidence that's needed during audit. So another thing within Audit Manager that's important to mention, this architecture actually shows a way for you to automate collection of non-technical evidence. And so if you're using Audit Manager for comprehensive framework, you know that there are many controls within PCI, for example, that are not necessarily something that you can gather technical evidence on. Maybe it's a document, maybe it's something that is in your SDLC lifecycle and you want to make sure you're uploading it. So this shows how you can, via Lambda function and API, have a trigger where a client can actually import manual pieces of evidence to go along with your automated collection evidence. So it's a way for you to introduce further automation into your compliance program. All right. So going through the shared responsibility model is important. This is something we talk a lot about as it relates to your AWS usage, because one of the things we're going to talk about next is artifact. And when we look at ways for how is AWS actually managing the physical security controls, and how does that layer on top of your responsible control environment in the cloud, it's super important that you understand the shared responsibility model because it changes based on the service. You can see in the example here, EC2, RDS, and S3 have very different lines as far as where that shared responsibility model, where your responsibility starts. And so when you're preparing for your regulatory review, or you're preparing for your third-party audit, or even satisfying information for one of your customers, you need to be able to tell the complete story, right? There is no possibility of saying, well, AWS has that covered, right? AWS is PCI compliant, so that applies to me. That is not the case. And so it's really important to understand at the control level where where you're inheriting AWS control. So one of the ways that you put these puzzle pieces together is you utilize AWS Artifact. So AWS Artifact provides that on-demand access to AWS security and compliance reports. And so when you're preparing for your SOC 2 or your PCI assessment, say for example, you would go to AWS Artifact, you would download the PCI report that represents the of the cloud environment, and you would piece that together with your in the cloud control environment. So that's how Audit is pulled together. And there was a new SDK released for connection to Artifact via API. So whenever there's a change, you can make sure that those reports that you have now on your system are always up to date. So you don't have to, it's not preventing you from going to the console, logging into Artifact, and downloading the reports. You can now introduce some automation via API into your own compliance management system. And so Artifact is always updated. In fact, I will say, I think 2 weeks ago, there was a new AWS best practices recommendation put onto Artifact regarding DORA, which is the Digital Operational Resiliency Act that's pending right now in the EU. So really important to be able to see how are we uploading those artifacts that are helping you understand the AWS shared responsibility model and also giving you guidance, right? We can tell you how AWS is maintaining compliance, but in many cases, like in the DORA publication, we're also helping you navigate how you're going to meet your own compliance objectives. And so those are some key initiatives to understand. So AWS Artifact is the auditor's best friend, right? Like the auditors that are in the room today need to know how to leverage AWS Artifact to go and get that of the cloud information so that you can be able to inherit a large percentage of the controls that you needed to manage on-prem are now being managed by AWS. And so I think with that, We want to make sure from a business outcome perspective, you're taking all the information that you learned today as ways to create efficiency, right? Any of you that have been in compliance for a year or 10 years or 20 years like me, you know that there's a lot of manual process. There's a lot of manual burden, time consuming, and so we're looking for ways that we can leverage the cloud to protect the cloud from a security perspective, but also how we can automate some of those day in and day out compliance tasks. And like I said, think about where those tools that we talked about fit in your journey. You know, the tools such as Config and Security Hub being used by dev teams, but having Audit be visible to everyone. And so we want to make sure that your compliance, future-proofing. The other thing I forgot to mention, too, within Audit Manager, a great example of how we're really helping to support your compliance initiatives is there was a Gen AI framework that was released in Audit Manager. And so thinking about how are we guiding you in collecting evidence from use cases such as Bedrock. And so if you go into Audit Manager and take a look at the controls that we have listed there, it gives you a step forward in being able to audit your own Gen AI applications that are possibly you've been testing and experimenting with. So we want to make sure that compliance as a differentiator is something you're thinking about. Also, I know Chad talked quite a bit about how do we look for reduction in errors, reduction in cost, reduction in time. Those are all very relevant to what we want to do. We want to ease some of the pain and burden from compliance. Allowing you to increase scope and allowing you the freedom to test out some of the new innovative approaches, like Gen AI is a great example. Making sure you have the right visibility of that Gen AI use and having Audit Manager there with a framework ready to go is one step further in the journey. And hopefully getting to that 1% to 2% reduction in audit cost. I really do believe that this can be much higher. The more that you automate and the more you create guardrails over gates within your DevSecOps journey, you can really increase a lot of automation and further, like I said, leveraging the innovative power of the cloud to protect the cloud and also allow cloud audit is the ultimate objective. So where do you start? Get some quick wins with AWS Control Tower. That is a fast way to introduce those proactive and preventative controls. Also be able to assess and estimate the burden of current control sets. I would say that a really good place to start is looking at the config managed rules. Seeing how many of those align, maybe conformance packs, to what you need to be compliant with today. Looking at your entire governance framework and trying to identify which of these technical controls can I actually automate. And that does, like I said before, that requires collaboration between all three lines of defense, right? The audit team knows what they need to audit, but until you dive deep into the technical aspects of what can be automated, there's a disconnect, right? And so with most of our customers, we see success and really advancing their compliance maturity when they're able to have those technical conversations between the audit and the development teams. Because developers want to automate as much as possible. They want to get through those final security and compliance guardrails to be able to innovate. And the best way to do that is to have open communication between the auditors and the developers, right? And the security team. So we need infrastructure, architecture, we need security team and applications to really collaborate and look for ways to move fast. Because if you can't move compliance fast, it will block the innovative things that you want to do in AWS. So we've got some links on the screen here, things we're recommending for you to read. And so you can scan those QR codes with your phone. We've got some ideas of where you can actually practice. There's an AWS Control Tower workshop for you to actually get your hands on and see what it's like to implement Control Tower. There's also a Control Tower Immersion Day that we recommend. And then Iterate with AWS Cloud Governance. It's a site that kind of guides you through how we think about cloud governance. And so hopefully these are helpful to you to get started. If you haven't been started, hopefully you're somewhere along the journey and we've given you some tips where you want to take that journey further. Begin your compliance engineering journey. I think I shared when I first started the audit entity that I created, I really didn't think about them as compliance engineers, right? But that's the mindset that I'm trying to create or trying to share with you now, is to be able to blend that audit mentality and that DevOps wanting to move fast. You need the right blending of skill sets to come together, and that to me is where compliance engineering comes into play. To be able to create those efficiencies, you need to break down those silos and work together to get the right automation and evidence collection to tell that full and complete story of your compliance on AWS. So I want to thank all of you again for taking the time, wearing the headphones, and I would like to thank also Navas and Chad for joining us in this presentation, and I hope you have the best rest of your Reinforce.